Welcome to the Eye on the Reef, Reef Health and Impact Survey Training Program. This module introduces the Reef Health and Impact Survey Form. In the previous module, we introduced the broad-scale ecological character of the Great Barrier Reef and some of the terms used to describe the different reef settings. In this module, we will be introduced to the layout of the Reef Health and Impact Survey data form, the habitats associated with reefs, and the categories of benthos you will need to recognise to fill out the form. This is the Reef Health and Impact Survey datasheet, and you'll probably find that it is easier to follow the learnings in this module if you have the datasheet in front of you. The first thing to say about the Reef Health and Impact Survey datasheet is that you'll probably want to call it RHIS for short. I know I do. The second thing to say about the RHIS form is don't panic. The RHIS form may look a little intimidating, but in truth, it's really a straightforward recipe for recording useful information in a consistent way. Most of what you need to know can be answered by making a few simple visual choices, which we'll explain in this video. Before we start, it's worth noting that the reason the form is so compact is to make it easier to handle. Having a single sheet format means less page turning underwater. We'll start off by taking a tour of the form by modules. Then we'll look at what you need to know to fill out each module. The RHIS form can be divided into three key parts: a section for details about the site and the person recording the information, a section to record the types of living organisms on the seafloor, with a special focus on algae and corals, and a final section which captures details of any impacts you can observe within a 5-metre radius from the centre of your survey circle. Please note that you need to record a separate datasheet for each of the point survey sites you sample. If you survey the recommended 3 sites at a location, make sure you indicate that this datasheet is 1 of 3, 2 of 3, or 3 of 3, etc. On the topmost section of the form, you enter your observer details. Please write legibly so the data can be entered correctly, and make sure that your contact details are current and accurate. The site information section needs to be filled in completely. Here are some tips. Consult a current zoning map to ensure you fill in the correct reef ID and marine park zone. Use decimal degrees when filling out the latitude and longitude. Where a box has been provided, please just give one response. Let's fill some in. The site was viewed on snorkel, at a depth of 5 metres, and a visibility of between 5 and 10 metres was observed. Also, you can measure the visibility by recording the Secchi depth. The Secchi depth sounds really technical, but is just a disc on a piece of string. You can look it up on Wikipedia. There is also a section for air and water temperature and tide. You will need to consult a tide chart to accurately record whether the tide at the survey time was low, mid, or high. Also, record if you observe any obvious flood plumes or algal blooms, or if you see none, just circle N. It is very important that you write the correct habitat code for the habitat type in which your survey was conducted. Here is a simplified guide to the different reef habitats laid out on an aerial image of a reef. The reef slope refers to the deeper edge section of the reef along its margins. The reef crest is where the waves break over the shallow areas of a reef next to the slope. The reef flat is the shallow, sometimes intertidal area on top of the reef. This picture is of a mid-shelf or platform reef, which often have a central area of deeper water on top of the reef known as the lagoon. Lagoons can trap water when the tide goes out and are deeper than the reef flat. Lagoon areas are usually sandy and contain fields of patch reefs known as bommies. Not every reef fits this model. For example, some reefs do not have a well-developed reef crest or reef flat on all sides. Here, the lagoon can grade into the reef slope at the back of the reef. On fringing reefs around islands and coasts, there may only be a reef slope, reef crest, and reef flat. At its simplest, we can summarise our reef habitat scheme as follows. The reef slope is where the reef falls away to deep water. On the Great Barrier Reef, this is typically from 5 to 30 metres. The reef crest refers to the area of the reef where the waves break. The reef flat is the shallow area on top of the reef that may be intertidal. It typically has water depths of 1 to 2 metres. The lagoon refers to the deeper areas on top of the reef, behind the reef crest and reef flat. And this lagoon may blend into the reef slope at the back of the reef. Finally, lagoons are usually sandy and with small reef patches called bommies. Now we come to the benthos subsection of the site information part of the RHIS form. Benthos is a term used to describe the plants and animals that live in or on the seabed. Recording information about benthos gives us a baseline snapshot of what we are seeing in our survey area. The benthos section provides the information that will be used to determine if reef condition has changed over time. So the accuracy of the information recorded is very important to the RHIS system. Filling out this section requires you to recognize some basic categories of benthos and the percent cover in your point survey site. The purpose of the RHIS system is to capture a snapshot of your survey point. Think of this snapshot as being a word picture that someone else needs to be able to interpret accurately. To make this possible, the RHIS form uses a simplified, coded language to describe what you see inside your 5-metre radius circle around your survey point. The RHIS system uses a simple 4-step process. Classify your benthos. Classify your benthos. You can do this using a few simple terms to describe the things you see on the seabed. Step 2. Add some lifeform information. I bet you thought I was going to say, add some lifeforms. But you were wrong. Lifeforms are simple terms to describe what corals look like. Step 3. Estimate the percent cover of the above categories. And step 4. Recording any physical or biological impacts. In summary, if done accurately, these simple steps build a word picture that describes your site. Now let's look at the same 4 steps in detail. Our classification is only concerned with 3 main benthic ideas. Things that are coral related, things that are algae related, and things that are substrate related. That's rock, rubble, and sand. That is, you need to recognize all the coral, algal, and substrate-related things inside your survey circle. Again, don't panic. It's a simple system. It's like falling off a boat. Once you've done it, you never forget how. Let's start with recognizing corals: hard, soft, live, dead, and otherwise. Coral is a generic term for a group of animals that have polyps. Polyps are simple tube-like animals with a ring of tentacles and a mouth for feeding and expelling waste. While there are many types of polyped animals, our scheme focuses on hard corals and soft corals. Hard corals vary greatly in shape and have a rigid, stony skeleton, although this can be hidden under polyp tissue. By contrast, soft corals are not stony, but flexible, and up close their polyps have 8 tentacles. Recognizing the difference between these two broad categories is easy with time spent underwater. This next section is a montage of hard and soft corals to give you a visual sense of what I mean. You're listening to Radio RHIS, the station for cool, soft corals. Because our substrate categories are related to coral, we will skip the algae section for now and come back in a moment. The next benthic category you need to recognise is dead coral. Because the majority of soft corals leave no trace when they die, you really only need to imagine the shape and forms of hard corals to understand this category. Recently dead hard corals are initially bright white, slowly becoming green or brown as their skeletons are overgrown with algae. Despite this colour change, while the coral remains in growth position, they also retain the detailed structures of the polyp skeleton. For RHIS purposes, recently dead coral will have died within recent weeks or months. By contrast to recently dead coral, the coral rock category refers to corals that are long dead. Coral rock implies a solid substrate that is most likely the dead skeleton of coral, although this may not be particularly obvious. Solid substrates can sometimes be made from things other than coral. That's okay. The point of this category is to know that it is solid and that it is not recently dead coral. Following this pattern of degradation, the next group is coral rubble, which obviously refers to dead, rubble or gravel-sized material that contains coral and other components that are loose and can be moved by wave action. Finally in this sequence is sand-sized material, which on a coral reef is made up of the broken down skeletons of myriad reef creatures. Now returning to the algae category. Algae, like corals, are a world to themselves, and we will cover them in more detail in the next module. But for now, let's just say that algae are plant-like. Here's a brief selection to get you started. Now that we have dealt with corals and algae, we can turn our attention to the substrate that they live on. On most reefs, the hard substrate below the corals is biological in origin. For that reason, the substrate categories of the RHIS form look like a continuation of live coral benthos, which is basically true, with some help from another player. Much of the reef's framework is built by coral, but in some environments, crustose coralline algae become important. Think of them as a thin stony glue that holds the coral skeletons together. On the living reef, the beautiful corals get all the limelight. Limelight, get it? That's a coral nerd joke in case you didn't know. Yet all the while, the crustose coralline algae are doing the hard work of holding the whole show together. So as time goes by, this dynamic duo of coral and coralline algae build the bulk of the reef framework, which is covered by even more corals seeking more limelight. Is there no justice? Well, no, there isn't. So we'll move on to what this means for our benthos classification. Here is what you need to recognise in the field. In the great scheme of things, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune mean that when live coral dies, it becomes recently dead coral with a white skeleton, or a white skeleton lightly covered in algae. For obvious reasons, the RHIS scheme wants to know about recently dead coral. Their pale white skeletons are a potential warning sign that something may be affecting the health of corals at a reef site. By contrast, coral that has been dead a long time, but is still firmly attached to the substrate, is referred to as live coral rock, or live rock for short. Live coral rock is made of coral and coralline algae. Compared to recently dead coral, it is drab and usually covered in algae and other living critters. Think of live coral rock as the solid bedrock of everything that lives on the reef. What we need is for you to recognise and distinguish it from recently dead coral skeletons. For the RHIS scheme, having an estimate of the cover of the coral rock in all its forms is important, because coral rock is the favoured substrate for coral larvae to settle on. The veneer of turfing or crustose coralline algae that live on live coral rock provide important settlement cues for settling coral larvae. So in summary, coral rock is long dead and firmly attached to the substrate. By comparison, coral rubble is basically chunks of loose coral rock that can be moved by wave action. Finally, and obviously, sand is the finer grade material made from broken down coral rock and plant and animal skeletons. So that's the basics of benthos. Clearly the RHIS scheme is designed to create a simple word picture of what is on the seafloor around your survey point. On a reef, the type and quantity of real estate is important. By recognising these simple categories and accurately filling out these forms, you will be communicating a useful ecological snapshot about your little patch of the Great Barrier Reef. In this module, we introduced the layout of the Reef Health and Impact Survey data form, the habitats associated with reefs, and the categories of benthos you will need to recognise to fill out the form. In the next module, we will be introduced to the standard recipe for conducting a RHIS survey.